Millionaire finds poor girl sleeping on floor with baby. What happened next will shock you. The night hung heavy over the city, wrapping every street in an unsettling stillness under the pale glow of the moon, where puddles shimmered faintly from an earlier drizzle, and the tall buildings stood like silent watchers over the deserted streets. James Thornton's sleek black car purred along the narrow road, his mind still lingering on the charity gala he had just attended, the soft murmur of rain now beginning to streak across his windshield. The rhythmic swipe of the wipers broke the quiet as he steered through darker parts of the city, passing shuttered shops with peeling paint and faded signs, the glow of street lamps thinning until they seemed more like ghostly embers than beacons of light. The air felt heavier here, colder, and as he drove past a tall, worn building with crumbling bricks and boarded windows, something caught his eye. A faint yellow light flickering through a broken pane. He slowed instinctively, curiosity gnawing at him, and peered through the rain-spattered glass of his car, his vision narrowing in on the source. The light trembled, weak and unsteady, perhaps from a dying bulb or an old lantern, and as he stared, he noticed a slight movement within the shadows. At first it looked like a discarded bundle, but then his eyes adjusted and he saw the outline of a human form. A young woman curled tightly on the cracked floor, her hair damp from the leaks above. Her thin body hunched protectively around something small pressed to her chest. That something was a baby, its tiny face nestled against her, hidden beneath a paper-thin blanket that clung wetly to them both. A slow drip from a rusty pipe above fell on her shoulder, but she didn't move, only tightened her hold on the child as if to keep the cold from swallowing him. The dim light cast long embling shadows across the empty walls, revealing chipped paint and bare concrete, and James's breath caught at the rawness of the sight. Her clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, her skin pale and weary, while the child's tiny fingers gripped the edge of the damp fabric in his sleep. The place had no furniture, no sign of comfort, just the echo of rain slipping through the roof and splattering onto the floor. The lantern's halo barely reached the corners of the room, leaving the rest in darkness, as if the world outside their small circle of warmth did not exist. James sat frozen behind the wheel, the hum of his heater suddenly feeling undeserved as he watched the way she curved her body around the baby like a shield, shivering but unyielding. Every breath she took a quiet act of defiance against the cold. He wondered how long they had been here, how many nights like this they had endured, and why fate had placed them in his view tonight. The rain blurred his vision, softening the edges of the scene, but not enough to hide the truth of it. This was not simply a hardship. It was survival, stripped to its barest form. A gust of wind swept through the broken window, causing the woman to pull the child closer, and in that small movement, James felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. The moon slipped behind a thick veil of clouds, as if hiding its gaze from the scene, while James remained still, caught between the impulse to keep driving and the undeniable pull that told him he could not. James's hand lingered on the cold metal of the door before he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, as if the building itself resented the intrusion. A sharp draft met him, carrying the damp, stale scent of rain-soaked concrete, and his polished shoes made hollow echoes on the cracked floor. The sound stirred the woman instantly. Her head lifted, strands of wet hair falling from her face, as her eyes locked on him with raw, animal-like alertness. There was no welcome in her gaze, only fear, the kind born from too many nights of uncertainty. Her arms tightened instinctively around the baby, pulling him closer as if shielding him from a threat. "Please, we'll leave if you want," she whispered, her voice a trembling thread in the vast emptiness, fragile yet carrying the weight of desperation. The words hung between them, and James noticed the way her lips barely moved, conserving whatever energy she had left. He raised a hand slightly, palm open, as if to assure her he meant no harm. "No, I'm not here to chase you away," he said softly, his tone carrying more warmth than the room itself. His gaze fell to the small bundle against her chest, and just then the baby shifted, letting out a faint whimper, the sound sharp and delicate against the silence. The child's tiny mouth opened in protest against the cold, his little fists pressing against the blanket. James's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years, a deep ache that made him kneel slightly, lowering himself so he wouldn't tower over her. His voice was low when he asked, "When was the last time you ate?" The woman's eyes flickered briefly, as if she were deciding whether to answer, and for a moment she simply looked at him, her breath visible in the chilled air. Finally she spoke with hesitation, her tone laced with shame she didn't deserve. "Yesterday, I gave the food to my baby." The admission struck him harder than he expected, a quiet blow that seemed to echo in the empty space around them. His breath caught, and for a brief moment he found himself unable to respond. He looked at her more closely now, at the faint hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she held the child. Not from fear now, but from exhaustion. The baby shifted again, a soft, restless sound escaping his lips, and James could see how the thin blanket did little to guard him from the cold. Water dripped somewhere behind them, a slow, rhythmic tapping that filled the pause between their words. The woman lowered her gaze, perhaps expecting him to turn away like so many others had before. But James didn't move. He noticed the faint trace of resolve in her. Even in her exhaustion, there was no self-pity, only a fierce and quiet determination to keep her child safe. Her voice was almost too soft to hear when she added, "He needs me to stay strong." James swallowed hard, realizing that in this moment, strength for her meant going hungry so the small boy in her arms could have just a little more warmth, a little more life. He glanced at the lantern beside her, its light weaker than before, shadows creeping closer along the cracked walls. The urge to act surged through him, but he forced himself to remain still, not to startle her, aware that trust in situations like this was something that could shatter easily. He shifted his weight slightly, lowering his voice again, the sincerity in his words unmistakable as he said, "You've done more for him than most could." For the first time, her eyes softened. Not fully, not with complete trust, but with a flicker of relief, as if hearing those words loosened something she had kept tightly bound inside. The baby's breathing slowed, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his small hand still clinging to the damp fabric of her shirt. James stayed there, watching the quiet resilience in front of him, the stillness broken only by the faint hum of the lantern and the sound of rain against the broken glass above. The rain had softened to a mist by the time they stepped out of the building, the streets glistening under scattered pools of lamplight. James walked a pace ahead, glancing back now and then to ensure the woman and her baby were keeping up, though she moved with the slow, deliberate caution of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. They reached a small corner cafe still open at the late hour, its golden light spilling onto the wet pavement like an invitation. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with coffee beans and freshly baked bread, the hum of a heater blending with the soft clink of dishes. James led her to a table tucked in the corner, away from the eyes of the few remaining customers, and gestured for her to sit. The baby stirred against her shoulder, but didn't wake, his breathing a steady whisper. A waitress appeared, her polite smile briefly faltering when she noticed the woman's damp hair and worn clothing. But James's steady tone as he ordered tea and something warm to eat left no room for hesitation. When the steaming cups arrived, the woman held hers carefully, as if the heat itself was a luxury she didn't want to waste. James watched her fingers wrap around the porcelain, noticing the small raw patches on her skin where the cold had bitten too deeply. She lifted the cup slowly, letting the warmth seep into her hands before taking a sip, and for the first time since he had met her, her shoulders loosened ever so slightly. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering, as though the question carried more weight than it should. "Lena," she said at last, her voice low but steadier now. He repeated it quietly, testing the sound, committing it to memory. As the tea cooled between them, her story began to emerge, not in a rush, but in halting pieces, each one carrying its own weight. She had been married once to a man she loved deeply, but a year ago he was taken from her in a sudden accident, leaving her with nothing but memories and a child she had promised to protect. There was no family to turn to. Her parents had passed years earlier, and her in-laws had vanished from her life the moment they realized she could no longer contribute financially. She spoke of trying to keep their small apartment, of working long hours in a job that barely paid enough for rent and food, until the choice became impossible, a roof with no meals or meals with no roof. She had chosen food for her baby until even that slipped beyond reach. "I just wanted my son to be safe," she murmured, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, the gesture more weary than embarrassed. "Even if it means I go hungry." Her eyes didn't seek pity, only understanding, and James found himself leaning forward, elbows resting on the table, the noise of the cafe fading behind her words. He wasn't just listening. He was absorbing the raw truth in every syllable, feeling the sharp edges of her grief and the quiet strength that had carried her through nights most people could never imagine. The candle on their table flickered, casting light across her face, illuminating the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the curve of her mouth as it trembled, though she held her voice steady. She didn't speak of herself as a victim. She spoke like someone who had fought battles in silence, who had endured each day because someone else's life depended on it. James didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions or reassurances. He simply listened, letting the weight of her story settle in his chest until it was no longer hers alone to bear. The rain had almost stopped by the time they left the cafe, leaving the streets slick and shining under the dim city lights. The air carried the faint smell of wet asphalt and distant chimney smoke, and James walked in silence beside Lena, his thoughts heavy but focused. He had heard her story, felt the weight of every word, and now there was a quiet certainty in his mind. He couldn't simply leave her to face another night in the cold. Without announcing his plan, he hailed a cab, holding the door open for her and making sure she settled in with the baby cradled securely in her arms. The ride was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from the little boy in her lap. Street after street slipped past, the buildings growing taller, their windows glowing warmly against the night. The cab finally pulled up to a towering hotel with polished glass doors and soft golden light spilling into the street. Lena's brow furrowed as she stepped out, glancing at James as if to confirm she wasn't mistaken. Inside, the lobby glistened with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place that spoke of comfort most people only saw in movies. The receptionist greeted James by name, her professional smile widening slightly when he requested a suite without hesitation. He guided Lena toward the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting her wide-eyed expression, her gaze darting between the intricate carpet patterns and the soft glow of the ceiling lights. When they reached the suite, James slid the keycard into the slot, and the door opened with a soft click. Warm light washed over them, revealing a spacious room with a king-size bed draped in crisp white linens, a seating area with plush chairs and thick curtains framing the city skyline. Lena froze just inside the doorway, her lips parting slightly as her eyes moved across the room, as if she wasn't sure it was real. The baby, sensing the change in atmosphere, wriggled in her arms before letting out a delighted giggle, his tiny hands reaching for the fluffy pillows on the bed. She crossed the room slowly, almost afraid to touch anything, and sat down on the edge of the mattress, the soft give beneath her weight drawing a quiet gasp from her lips. James watched as she traced her fingers across the blanket, then over her son's cheek, holding him close as her shoulders began to shake. Tears welled in her eyes before spilling freely, streaking down her face in silent gratitude. "No one's ever helped us like this," she whispered, her voice breaking under the force of the moment, as if the years of holding herself together had finally met a place safe enough to fall apart. James stepped closer, his presence calm and steady, and offered a faint smile that carried more promise than words. "From now on," he said quietly, "you're not alone." The sentence seemed to hang in the air, filling the space between them with a warmth the cold night outside could not touch. Morning light streamed through the large windows of the hotel suite, soft and golden, carrying with it the faint hum of the city waking below. Lena stirred slowly, her baby still nestled in the crook of her arm, his tiny breaths warm against her skin. For a moment, she simply lay there, letting the unfamiliar comfort wash over her. The feel of clean sheets, the quiet hum of the heater, the safety of knowing they had made it through the night without fear. James had been up early, his voice low as he spoke briefly on the phone in the other room, the quiet urgency of his tone hinting that he was already setting plans in motion. When she finally stepped out, holding her son close, he was waiting with a calm expression, a subtle spark of purpose in his eyes. Without much preamble, he told her he had found something for her, a small apartment across town, fully furnished and ready for them to move in that very day. Her eyes widened as he described it. A clean, warm space with a stocked kitchen, soft beds, and a place where her child could crawl across the floor without the cold biting at his skin. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to steady herself under the weight of his words, her fingers tightening slightly around her son. But James wasn't finished. He told her there was a position waiting for her in one of his companies, a role she could step into immediately, with fair pay and the stability she had been denied for so long. Lena's lips parted in disbelief, her voice soft as she asked the only question that came to mind. Why me? James met her gaze without hesitation, his voice steady and sure when he answered, because I believe kindness can change someone's entire life. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the words settling between them like something fragile and sacred. Lena's eyes shimmered, not just from gratitude, but from the sudden realization that for the first time in months, perhaps years, someone saw her not as a burden, but as a person worth investing in. She lowered her gaze briefly, struggling to form the right response, but James simply offered a reassuring nod, as if to say she didn't need to thank him. Outside, the day stretched open, full of possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. The seasons had shifted since that morning, and the air now carried the soft warmth of spring as sunlight spilled gently across the rooms of Lena's apartment. The faint scent of fresh flowers drifted in through the open balcony door, carried by a breeze that stirred the light curtains. On the living room carpet, her son played with bright wooden blocks, his laughter ringing out in bursts of pure joy that filled the space with life. Lena stood near the window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, her gaze wandering across the quiet street below. She thought back to the night when the world had felt impossibly dark, when every step had been heavy with uncertainty, and the cold had seemed like an unshakable shadow. She could still see the rain streaking down that broken window, still feel the ache in her chest from holding her child close against the chill, believing there was no way forward. Yet here she was, her home filled with light, the shelves lined with books and small plants she tended in the mornings, the kitchen fragrant from the loaf of bread cooling on the counter. The transformation felt almost unreal, and yet every detail was a reminder of what had changed, of the single act of compassion that had shifted the entire course of her life. It had taken only one man's choice to stop, to step into a forgotten building instead of passing it by, and that moment had become the hinge on which her story turned. James visited often, his presence as steady and unassuming as the sunlight that poured through her windows. On those days, the sound of her son's feet would thunder down the hallway the moment the doorbell rang, followed by a squeal of recognition as the little boy launched himself into James's waiting arms. The two would laugh together, the child chattering about his day in a way only a toddler could, and James would listen as though every word was the most important thing he had heard. Lena watched those moments with quiet gratitude, knowing her son was growing up not only safe but surrounded by care. In their home, James wasn't introduced as a benefactor or a man of wealth. He was greeted as family, someone whose kindness had become woven into the fabric of their everyday lives. And as Lena stood there, the sunlight warm on her face, she realized that the greatest change was not in the walls around her or the food in her kitchen, but in the certainty that they were no longer alone in the world. That no matter what came next, they had someone who would always choose to step inside rather than walk away.